Shiloh Baptist Church
had its humble beginnings in 1863 when a band of 21 ex-slaves who had been gathering at the home of Henry D. Payton on K Street wanted to be recognized as a true church. They had worshiped in the little shanty for almost a year. These ex-slaves had arrived in the city from Fredericksburg, Virginia, under the protection of the Potomac branch of the Union Army in the fall of 1862. Tell the historic beginnings of Shiloh Baptist Church is Shiloh Baptist Church's own Deacon John A. Grigsby III.
I'm James H. Grigsby III. I'm a deacon here. I've been a member for 75 years.
In 1863, these religious men and women asked for the formation of a recognition panel to determine if they were a bona fide church. On September 23, 1863, the Shiloh Baptist Church of Washington, D.C. was established. On September 27, 1863, Reverend William J. Walker was ordained and installed as the first pastor.
William J. Walker, who got his credentials, he was there were other members of the black race that had come up from Fredericksburg, but here was a man that was a scholar, and he was able to read and write.
Unfortunately, Reverend Walker died in 1889. In 1890, Shiloh finally called the Reverend James Anderson Taylor to be the second pastor of Shiloh.
J. Anderson Taylor, and he came in and he put in great contributions.
Reverend Taylor developed the music ministry at Shiloh by purchasing a new organ for $3,000, and it is said that Shiloh was the first vested African-American church choir in the city.
Then we had Reverend Dr. J. Milton Waldron, who was the third pastor.
Waldron, who had been in Washington, D.C. previously as the pastor of the Berean Baptist Church. He came with the idea of making Shiloh an institutional church. In 1930, Shiloh called Reverend Earl Leonard Harrison to become the fourth pastor. He came during the Great Depression when Shiloh was in debt and the morale of the dwindling congregation was low.
Reverend Dr. Earl L. Harrison, who baptized my big brother, my second brother, and me in 1934. And we were baptized in the old church that had the baptismal pool down on this floor. Henry C. Gregory came as the fifth pastor, and he served here for 17 years.
Reverend Henry Clayton Gregory III. He was no stranger to the church, having been mentored by Reverend Harrison and becoming a son of Shiloh, and he had served as the assistant pastor of Reverend Harrison.
Wallace Charles Smith, the senior minister of the Shiloh Baptist Church in Washington, D.C.
In 1991, Shiloh called its sixth pastor, Reverend Wallace Charles Smith. He came from Nashville, Tennessee, and came with a vision to maintain the wonderful legacy of the historic church to which he was called.
And Dr. Henry C. Gregory passed, which would have been 1990. The church went on a national search and learned of my work. I was pastoring in Nashville, Tennessee at the time. They invited me to come and to preach a sermon and appreciated what I presented, and subsequently asked me to stay on as the senior minister. All of life is change. But in the midst of life's change, there's some things that we have to affirm and assert, and that is that against all of the physics of change and string theory and the like stands a God who my Bible says changes not.
Do you think that it's important for African Americans to be members of historically black churches such as Shiloh?
Yeah, I do. You know, when you say historically black church, I mean churches that share in the struggle for liberation. I think that's important because younger people, because of the relaxation of the boundaries between black and white, may not fully understand the depths of racism that still exists in our society. I think it's been eye-opening for some younger people to see that even though Barack Obama is the President of the United States, I mean, much of the vitriolic nature of the attacks on him is racist bound. And so I think in a historically African-American church, you learn to deal, just like going to an HBCU. I mean, you learn to deal with the realities of being black in a still white world.
Nothing can separate you from the love of God, but God's anger will wax hot against those who ignore God's sovereignty and God's power. Oh, and I look back over my life and realize what God has done. How can I help but to give him thanks? Moses said you ought to remember. You ought to remember all that. But then here's where the text shifts gears. I talked about change a minute ago. Because the Message translation says right after that section, it says, but forget about all that. Forget about all that. He said, because God is doing a new thing.
Under his leadership, Shiloh is striving to become a village that reflects God's love for his people. Under the village concept, Shiloh will continue to teach and share the word in the neighborhood, around the city, and throughout the world so that the souls will be saved and that the hearts will be changed.